सारे ख़वातीन और हज़रात, वेलकम बैक टू अनदर एपिसोड ऑफ थॉट बिहाइंड थिंग्स। आज हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं दो बहुत ही ख़ास मेहमान जिनको सच्ची बात है कि आई हैव बीन ट्राइंग टू कॉल फॉर द गुड पार्ट ऑफ लास्ट 1 year, बट कलसूम पर्टिकुलरली शी इज़ सो इन एंड आउट ऑफ पाकिस्तान कि उनको पकड़ना मुश्किल ही नहीं नामुमकिन होता है। दिस वन टाइम जब पूरा पाकिस्तान तबाही की दनेश पे खड़ा है और लॉन्ग मार्चेज आ रही हैं और हमारे तमाम गेस्ट कैंसिल कर चुके हैं, तो शी इज़ बिन काइंड इनफ टू एक्चुअली कम इन विद अस टुडे। वी हैव Kalsoom Lakhani, who is the co-founder and general partner of I2I Ventures and also the founder of Invest to Innovate. One of the oldest names in the Pakistani startup culture. जब कुछ भी नहीं था, जब एक wild west था of startups in Pakistan, so she was out there with a beacon saying कि there is a possibility this is gonna bloom, and it did over time. We also have with us Misbah Naqvi, who's the co-founder and general partner at I2I Ventures. Guys, thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thanks for having us.
Kalsoom, I'm going to start off with you, just trying to understand थोड़ा सा आपकी early life कहाँ पे थी, education, and what was life like growing up?
Yeah, so I sound totally American, but I'm not an ABCD. Still confused probably, but I was born in Dubai, and my mom is from Bangladesh, my dad is from Pakistan, so given the history of those countries, that's a conflict in and of itself. Moved to Dhaka when I was 6. Lived there till I was 11, and for me it was really great to kind of grow up. I have all my nani was there, my khalas, all my cousins were there, and then moved to Islamabad. My dad's from Karachi, but my mom, her one condition to my dad when we were moving the kids to Pakistan was that Karachi was too dangerous in the 90s, so Islamabad it is. When Islamabad in the 90s, you know this, Muzamil was very much more chill than it is now. Yeah. So yeah, I moved to Islamabad when I was 11, and I graduated from high school here. So that's
very cool.
Really
and what was the year when you were in Dhaka?
Dhaka, I was there from 88 to 94.
How would you compare Dhaka? I mean, that was a long
Dhaka
time ago.
to Karachi, you can compare. I don't think you can compare Dhaka to.
So maybe
Islamabad.
how do you compare Bangladesh to Pakistan?
It's interesting because I've always seen it from the lens of family. And so I always thought Dhaka for me felt like family because I grew up around everybody. So because when I moved to Islamabad, I didn't have any family around us, right? My whole family was in Karachi. So it's not really a fair comparison for me. But Bangladesh, and at least as a girl and a little girl growing up, felt, I come from a really matriarchal family. Like my nani was a big player in the nationalist movement for Bangladesh. She was big communist. So I have all these feminist matriarchs in my family.
And so her daughter ended up marrying a Pakistani. Was that not a disaster?
Yeah, my mom and dad eloped actually.
Wow.
But also, I think my whole family, I've always had a very matriarchal, heavy on women family. And so I kind of grew up around that, which was all these women that were unapologetically just who they were. So it was a really cool way to grow up. And I think as a girl in Bangladesh, generally, there's a lot more safety, a lot more mobility. So if I was to compare that to Pakistan, you have to be a lot more careful. I think there's more safety issues, more things that women think about when it comes to mobility and safety here. And I was obviously I dressed more conservatively when I moved to Pakistan versus when I was in Bangladesh. But yeah, I think I always look at similarities rather than differences. So I always think even now in the work that we do, I always see so much that I think we could do together rather than what keeps us apart. But yeah, for me, it was more as a kid, I think it was growing up around all this, I always call it this color that you grow up around, right? And these stories, I grew up around all these stories of my family and my family in 71, my family in 47. And then you kind of move to Islamabad, which I love Islamabad, by the way. So I'm not saying it's so drastic, but I think it was a big difference from what I was around when I was little.
Interesting. And graduating high school, where did you go for college?
So I graduated in 2000 from the international school here, and then I went to the University of Virginia for college in America.
In what major?
My major was in Middle East Studies and Foreign Affairs, which Middle East Studies back then included South Asia. So if I wanted to study Pakistan, they included Pakistan. Now I'm Pakistan is not part of the Middle East, but back then they were just whatever, everything's together. So I started studying, I fell in love with politics the minute I got to college, and I went to school when 9/11 happened. So for me to be in college during 9/11 and to really think about the fact that I was this young Pakistani Pakistani in the US, a young Muslim in the US, it kind of puts your identity at war. And it's so you feel a sense of responsibility of what am I doing to kind of change this narrative? And for me at the time, foreign affairs and politics was how I thought that could be the way for change.
Interesting. And what was life like? I mean, especially after 9/11.
Yeah.
Because had you lived in the US before that?
No, I used to travel in the summers to the US. So my American accent, my brother and sister during my own shadi literally said in their speech, they're like, Kalsoom was born with these big dimples and a big American accent. No one in my family knows where it came from. And it's just stayed stronger and stronger as I've lived abroad. But yeah, I'd only gone to the US for summers to visit my khala. I lived in DC, so I would go there. But that's it. So I had never lived in the U.S. until I went when I was 18 for university.
And why politics? Was that something you chose straight out of high school, or
no?
Was it like
I actually wanted to go to film school. So, and if anyone knows me, knows I love talking about film, and like will still to this day love like movies.
Have you seen Knowledge yet?
No, it's not. But I'm going to be in Dubai in a couple of days, and I've been trying to get it on because I haven't had any time. We've been working nonstop, so Malajat is going to be on my list. I really want to see Joyland, which was given for Oscar.
I think that's coming out on the 18th of November.
Yeah, and it's been given for Oscar consideration, which is a really big deal. But yeah, really big fan of film. And so as a kid, I thought, I don't know, I translated my love of movies into wanting to go to film school. Obviously, my father was not excited about that. So went to a liberal arts school instead, even though I did get into film school, and thought I would study film when I got there. And my first class I took was politics, and it was a comparative politics 101 class at UVA, and I fell in love with it. I loved the idea of looking at the way historically countries have warred against each other, how things have developed. And I think that's what attracted me to, I did my master's in conflict resolution, which I think being Bangladeshi and Pakistani already is conflict resolution in itself. So I've always been someone who's been between two worlds and two identities. It's kind of the interesting thing of you don't really belong anywhere. And so I think doing conflict resolution was almost like an extension of that. So I've always been fascinated by why people fight. And also, why should they fight when there's so much to actually, resolve and actually be at peace about? So I've always loved studying that. And even when I studied that in undergrad and in politics in school, that was a lot of my focus as well. I studied a lot about war. And then obviously going to school during the war on terror, quote unquote, I became really fascinated about that. So that's, what led to me going to grad school. I went to grad school in Washington, D.C., which is where a lot of people study politics. And doing conflict resolution was really kind of my part of trying to understand, like, how do we resolve conflict? And that's not what I worked in first, but that's honestly what Ms. Ben and I joke about today. I use my master's degree in conflict resolution all the time as an investor, probably more than someone using an MBA sometimes, but it's really come to use. So
but that's very interesting, because I would have imagined, if I were to sort of extrapolate your path, 2003-4 forward, right straight out of 9/11, you're a Pakistani in DC doing masters in conflict resolution. I would think you'd be probably working for, like, let's say USIP.
I did work for some of those places. Yeah.
So what was the pathway? I mean, from that to actually being an investor?
Yeah, it's very non-linear. I started working in, when you're an international student working in the U.S. and want to work, a lot of your options tend to be very limited. And so ended up getting a job in defense contracting, which is the opposite of conflict resolution, and hated it. But it was during the war on terror again. So like when everything was the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, everything was focused on that. And given the lens that I had of being a Muslim in America, I actually thought, I would rather have my voice in the room than a lot of non-Muslim voices in those rooms, right? And so was working in that, worked on a lot of counter-suicide bombing campaigns, counterinsurgency stuff, what messaging looks like. I worked as an analyst there. And at first really liked it and then realized that no one really cared what I had to say as like a 23-year-old or 24-year-old. And, you know, in these rungs of power, I was really at the lowest. And so I ended up at the time, because it is these moments where you can kind of feel like a victim in your own job. And I was there because I had a work visa and I couldn't really get out of it because I had a visa. And I remember at the time, Pakistan was on the cover of Newsweek magazine for being the most dangerous country on earth, right? And I've always been someone that's been struck by injustice. So every time I feel like something is unjust, I want to do something to change it. And I've been really lucky because my dad is a serial entrepreneur. My dad is someone who's like, if you want to change it, go do it, right? That's always my dad and what he always used to say to me and does say to me. And so that's when I started a current affairs blog on Pakistan called CHUP, or Changing Up Pakistan, which was back in when blogs were podcasts, Muzamil. But basically started it, and I started to write, took my skill set of being an analyst and started to write about the stories about Pakistan, and did it through the lens of someone that actually was Pakistani, but also beyond writing about politics, which I kind of did from a more funny voice and analyzing what was happening in the news. I would also write about the news, about things that you weren't reading about in the news, right? So the filmmakers, the change makers, the artists. I just actually randomly had a chat, not to name drop, but just randomly chatted to Marine Jabbar, who's an awesome filmmaker. And I reminded her, she reached out to me on LinkedIn. I was like, I don't know if you remember, I interviewed you for my blog back in like 2000, this was 2006, right? 2007. And she's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even remember, but she had like a really cool, but because I loved film, I was always wanting to write about that stuff. And that got a lot of traction in really cool ways. I then realized there was a voice that I had that was unique, but also was empowering, right? Which I think now this younger generation of like, you know, Gen Zers really with TikTok and everything that's out there really have that. But back then I realized at this job where I felt very disempowered, I had this very empowering platform where I could write and do things on my own terms. And then during the day, I moved jobs. I moved into venture philanthropy, which is kind of taking a venture approach to philanthropy. So rather than just doing charity, actually saying, how can we give charitable dollars to support enterprises when they're starting out, right? And
that's interesting. And I'll pause you here.
Yeah.
Because when you look at Islamabad, whenever I'm speaking to someone from Karachi, they have this very clear understanding of how to do business and how to scale businesses and how to really create sustainable economic activity. When I talk to someone from Islamabad, more often than not, they'll tell you all about how they're going to change the world, but they have absolutely no clue on how to really sustainably do it, right? And I really thought about it and realized a large part of that has been the development sector, really the DNA of the development sector that's been here since the 1980s, with a lot of the US aid money coming in and German aid and so on and so forth. And so the entire style of how, people in Islamabad used to do things was create a report, submit it to an organization. They would give you an X amount of funding, and so you'll be able to work for 3 years, show what you've done in those 3 years. But as soon as the funding dries up, you're out of a job. But personally, as an Islamabadi, I really hated the way that the startups mostly tend to work, because they're really driven by these handouts.
Yeah, I was about to say the handout culture.
Because they're going to continuously tell you all about how they're changing the world. Sure, that's great, but if you can't have a sustainable model, you can't do it in a scalable, in a way that could truly creates impact beyond the personality, right? And so this is a very interesting term that you've mentioned, venture philanthropy.
Yeah, and it's actually how I ended up meeting Misbah for the first time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And so if you can just sort of quickly explain what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time I was, so my parents had moved to the US at the time, but my dad's back in Islamabad now, and my dad had always done traditional charity, right? He actually has a free hospital here in Islamabad, did a feeding program, did all this amazing, amazing work that was really inspiring. And I think as a kid, I always grew up with my parents teaching us kind of through like watching them about giving back. But I was really interested in social enterprises at the time, social impact. And when I kind of came on into, at the time, his family and our family office, I was like, how do we do what you're doing, but in a much more sustainable way? So not just charity where it's a handout, right? But actually say, like, can high risk, no return capital, which is philanthropy, can that be given to companies or to businesses that could do a lot, could actually, need that money where they could prove out something and then maybe go out and raise investment. And these were the early days of this space, right? This was like 2008. You were doing it in 2006. But, for me, I was really interested in that. I was going to these conferences and learning about it. I never even heard the term venture philanthropy. I never even really knew what social impact was. I was coming out of, again, like politics and that space, and that's what I was surrounded by, and really felt inspired by it. And so because, I am from Islamabad, but I grew up with my dad's in business. I come from a business family. So I kind of have been ingrained kind of through osmosis, all of these stories of failure in business my whole life. And so in some ways, this was starting to bring it all together, especially because I was writing about all these amazing young change makers at night, right? I was writing this blog that was getting all this traction. And so during the day, I was like, how do we more meaningfully support people rather than just say like, here's $1,000 or here's like, a lakh, like go do something, and actually say, can we support them? And I do think in a lot of ways, those were the early seeds of how I started to get into this space. I was going to all these conferences all over the world and was really lucky to do that, where I was meeting all these people, but every time I was meeting them, it was great, but everyone would pat each other on the back and they were all supporting the same businesses. Like all the businesses that were the same, who sounded really good on paper, they looked a certain way, everyone was polished, they were the ones getting the money, right? And they were all in the same places. So they were mostly, if you were looking at emerging markets back then, it was India, Mexico, East Africa, Kenya. Pakistan was like on no one's radar, right? And in the meantime, I'm still working on that. We're giving money to people here, and also like we were supporting doing some really cool initiatives in the U.S. as well. But I remember just thinking, God, that's so unfair. So again, back to the injustice of it. I was meeting all these amazing young people, and then in Pakistan when I was doing the work here and also writing about them, and then I would talk to them 4 or 5 months later, and nothing had happened with their businesses, right? Because there was no one here to support it. And I was like, what if we could more meaningfully support that change? And that's where I realized while I was doing it within our family office, I felt like if I really wanted to do this, it would have to be on my own. And a lot of love to my dad and everything, but that actually laid the seeds for why Invest to Innovate was born in 2011, because it really came from a genuine place of listening to a lot of things around me and feeling just really angry about this potential that was existing in places that no one was talking about. And just because no one was talking about it doesn't mean that it wasn't important, right? And I think as someone who is Pakistani, but also, Bangladeshi, I saw the same thing there, same thing with people in Nigeria at the time, people in Vietnam. I was like, just because you exist in a place that might be hard to do a business doesn't mean we shouldn't support that potential. And that's really where Invest to Innovate was born. So I left my job then and decided to start in 2011. Not a lot, but just with an idea, right? I just really believe that. And I think that conviction is something that has kind of helped. The reason I've done this for so long, you were talking about being kind of in the wild, wild west of everything, but it genuinely came from a place of, if not me, then who, right? Like someone has to do this. And I hope it's someone else. And there's so many other people now in the startup space, but Invest to Innovate was really born out of this belief that this support needs to be, these entrepreneurs, these young people need to be supported, right? And I couldn't rely on the fact that I was going to wait for something to happen and maybe that change will come. But again, to the point about Islamabad, these maybe being kind of those change makers. And I never thought about it as an Islamabad thing, but I always have been like that. But more from a place of how do we support businesses, right? Yeah. And that's really where Invest to Innovate was born from.
Makes sense. And I think one of if I were to look at it, I think Islamabadis are the idealists that really think about what future could look like, and Karachi ones are the ones who can really convert that vision into something more practical.
Maybe it's good that my dad's from Karachi, so I had both within me.
Yeah. I'm gonna switch it up to Misbah. I'm sorry for taking so long, 20 minutes into the conversation, but tell me a little bit about your early life and what led you to being here where you are today.
I was born in Karachi. My father was in the Navy, so luckily the only places we went back and forth was Karachi and Islamabad. So I also grew up in Islamabad back in the 80s, moved here for a few years, been back and forth, and Went back to Karachi. We lived in Paris for a few years. My father was posted there, and then came back and went to IBA. So I often say, like, I did my MBA back when MBAs were cool. Graduated in 97, and I started working with Citigroup in Pakistan on the corporate banking side. Worked in transaction banking, worked in corporate finance. And 5 years in, I think I realized, now in hindsight, I realized that I had just been going through the motions. It was like school mein acha, I wasn't great at science, so chalo economics pad lete hain, accounting pad lete hain. And I got it and I enjoyed it. And so it was like, acha, business kar lete hain, let's do an MBA. And it kind of said, okay, if you're doing an MBA, then, marketing anybody can do. Finance karna chahiye. So I was like, okay, let's do finance. And then it was, if you're doing finance, then you had two options, brokerage or banking. And I interned in both. And at that time, brokerage was going through a slowdown. So banking it was. Then I was like, acha, bank mein ja rahe hain, so you should go to like a foreign bank. And if it's a foreign bank, then it should be one of two or three. So I was going through the motions and kind of aspiring towards things now in hindsight that I think were around me, but were not driven by me. And 5 years into my work at Citi, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't want my boss's job. I'm not excited about the things my peers are excited about, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I had started having conversations with my boss, with the country head, and they actually were looking to move somebody into public affairs. This was post 9/11, so an American bank in Pakistan, but also somebody that understood the ethos of the bank and what the bank stood for. And I put my hand up and I said, yeah, this sounds really interesting. And I remember my colleagues were like, they thought that I'd been demoted, or they were like, are you sure you want to do this? Career suicide, right? It's like, are you serious? Like, I think they thought I was, smoking some funny shit. But I did make that move, and that was great because it gave me an opportunity to work in the CEO's office very closely with him at a time where there was a lot of policy change happening. With Dr. Ishrat was at the State Bank. Citigroup played a really key role in informing policy at the time, so it was big learning for me. I also got a chance to not only do internal and external communications, but work with Citigroup Foundation for their projects in Pakistan. We had the earthquake at the time in Kashmir in the north. Was able to raise funds for that. We supported great organizations working in rehabilitation and relief. And was also able to get a better sense of the development space. And that's where I came across Acumen, which I ended up joining, which is how Kalsoom and I met. And Acumen at the time was looking to enter Pakistan. So they are a social venture fund, which means that they raise philanthropic funds and then they invest it with a double bottom line approach, which really means that you not only look at social impact, but you also look at sustainability. So venture philanthropy is the other side of that, because that's from the giving side, that's what they're doing with their philanthropy. And on the execution side, what we were doing was taking charitable money and then investing it in debt equity into social enterprises. So startups that were companies, early stage companies, I wouldn't even call all of them startups, early stage companies that were working in healthcare, housing, agriculture, education, financial access, things like that. And they were setting up their office in Pakistan at the time. And I joined them. The country manager at the time sort of hired me for this role, and we built the team together. And at that time, it kind of felt like everything that I'd done to that point helped get me to being a better impact investor, because I was able to use all of my finance training and background for good. And that really resonated. I think as somebody at that time in my late 20s, early 30s, it really filled a lot of boxes for me, checked a lot of boxes. And I'm really grateful for that experience, because it allowed me to see my own country in a way that I hadn't before. As you can imagine, in the 80s, growing up as a Navy brat, as a military kid, we didn't have a lot of money. So we're definitely not privileged in terms of income and economic status, but definitely very privileged in terms of education. And I have to acknowledge that my parents did whatever they could to send me to good schools, and I was privileged from that perspective. And I think having gone from good schools to IBA to Citibank, I was in a bit of a bubble. And it wasn't until I was with Acumen that I got a chance to go into the field, to go into bastis, to sit in kachi abadis, and really I tried to understand how people make decisions about where their money goes, what do they have access to, what are the gaps and opportunities in Pakistan where people don't have access to goods and services. Right.
So if I were to ask you, for example, the money that Acumen gives, is that like completely like charitable money, take the money, do whatever you want with it? Or is it more like, okay, we'll give you the money, but we'll take, let's say, 2% of whatever you guys do? Or is it like, we'll give you the money, but you have to pay us that money back, with better terms than, let's say, the bank?
Yeah. So at the time, and Acumen's philosophy has changed over the years. So I'm not going to say that holds true for today. But at the time, the idea was to invest patient capital. And what that meant was that they were, like Kalsoom was saying, people were not taking risk at those stages in those spaces. So Acumen came in as a capital provider where there was no other capital, but not at exorbitant rates, because they had a philanthropic goal, because they had a social impact goal.
It was debt essentially.
It was debt and equity, but it was patient. So they said, अच्छा ठीक है, not 2 साल में नहीं, आप हमें 5 साल में पैसे वापस करें या 7 साल में पैसे वापस करें, and you don't have to pay us 50% or 30%, you pay us 5%. There was a bit of a subsidized rate as well as a patient approach in terms of the time frame. And then the idea was that you would recycle those returns back into the fund and therefore continue to grow the pool of money going back into the space.
But there was still some sort of an accountability.
There was accountability. There was a focus on sustainability. So the idea was that you were having social impact, but you're also using money and investing it in your business so that the business can grow. But you're also treating consumers like customers. And you may be charging 2 rupees for that liter of water, but you're charging something. So that there's, again, an acceptance of the product, and people will actually pay for it. So that basically was great because it gave me a chance to see my own country like in a way that I hadn't. I then moved with them from Pakistan to New York. I was in the New York office for a while. And a few years later, I actually joined a Fintech startup that was focused on a global product around 2-factor authentication. So think of it like OTP, but not one-time password. Like, when you're doing a transaction, you get so it was actually a dynamic password. So without getting too technical, it was basically a fintech. And so for me, coming from the finance side, I finally got, that was my first exposure to technology. It was also, I was employee number 2 in a startup, and my first sort of first-hand experience on how tough startup life is. And then we were building in markets like Pakistan and India, but Afghanistan as well, South Africa, Tanzania, Middle East.
What was the name of the organization?
Valoro.
Okay. Are they still operational in Pakistan?
They're not operational in Pakistan right now. They've done a few other markets since then, and their business model has also shifted over the last few years. And I'm talking about 10 years ago now when I joined them. So the company's seen quite a few different iterations now. But it was great as giving me an opportunity to understand how tough things can be in markets like ours, right? To the point that Kalsoom was talking about, where she saw firsthand the opportunity in Pakistan, but also recognized that people were not moving because it's so tough and that support is needed. I was on the other side of that, where we could see firsthand how difficult these markets are. So it gave me an appreciation for founders and startups, but also looking at how big these opportunities are in markets like ours.
Makes sense. And so you were with that startup for how long?
For close to 5 years.
Acha.
Yeah.
And the next switch was eventually I2I Ventures, or
Yes. The switch was, I wanted to take a sabbatical, and I just thought I'd take a step back after 20 years. And when Kalsoom built I2I, Invest to Innovate, she asked me to be on her board of advisors. So since 2011 when we launched, I've been involved with I2I at an advisory level. And so I was kind of seeing where that was going. And we used to have regular conversations. And I wanted to take a sabbatical, take a step back for a year, and I thought I'd figure out what I want to do next, take some time off,
sit on a beach,
read, catch up on movies and books. My friends make fun of me because I don't end up watching movies, and they're like, you just keep adding to your list of things you want to do. That list is still going, because the sabbatical did not end up being a year, it ended up being 2 months, because I decided to join Kalsoom.
So I took her telling me she was doing a sabbatical as an invitation to invite her to join me in building a fund, which is the opposite of a sabbatical.
Okay, so थोड़ा सा मैं यहाँ पर आप लोगों को एक वो दे दूँ, disclaimer दे दूँ कि हम अंग्रेजी में क्यों बात कर रहे हैं, because Kalsoom is much more comfortable speaking in English, and so दरमियान में जो नीचे आके comments लिख रहे हैं, आप उर्दू में क्यों नहीं बात करते? I sincerely apologize.
I apologize too. Sorry.
But nonetheless, I'm going to move towards Invest to Innovate. We've talked about it a few times. I'm sure those who don't know are just now scratching their heads. Okay, what exactly is I2I? And tell me a little bit about what you guys have been up to since 2011 forward.
So Invest to Innovate, as I was mentioning before, really started with a vision of, we believe the next great innovators are coming from the most unexpected places, right? And we started in Pakistan because that's where I was from. It's where my base was, my network was. And we started just at the very first day one was starting, I just started working with entrepreneurs, right? I was like, who can I help? What can I do? Realized that's a terrible business model because no one can afford to pay you when they're starting out their business. And then realized as we were building, I was like, actually there's, I kept hearing this term accelerator, incubator, all these terms that were not even really here yet at the time. And it was the same year that Plan 9 was starting. The Plan 9 was Punjab Information Technology Board's incubator. And so I, at the time was like, an accelerator could be really interesting. An accelerator, if you think about it in the life cycle of a company, an incubator is when it's an egg to a chick. So when something's an idea to like a baby idea, and an accelerator is a chick to a chicken or a baby chicken, right? So it's like, how do you help grow the idea a little bit? I think at the time, Pakistan was too early even for an accelerator, but we started Pakistan's first startup accelerator at the time. And it really came out of, as we were listening to all these entrepreneurs, everyone had the same problems, right? Everyone was like, I don't have a community, I need help on marketing. And I was like, instead of me, I can't multiply me, right? I was like, instead of me working with 5 companies, I was like, who am I to do all this, right? Why not build a program that helps entrepreneurs in like batches, right? And now everyone hears about the National Incubation Centers and the accelerators. This was like not a concept back then. And even when I would ask people about it, I was like, I want a sponsor for this. Like no one even knew what I was talking about. So we had like, I think like $6,000 in our bank account at the time. And I was like, we have money. I was like, let's just test it and go. This was in 2012, the first batch ever. We had Lums gave us space for free. So we used that. We did 5 weekends in Lahore with our first 5 companies who are our guinea pigs. And we basically brought in outside experts. We brought in people that did trainings around their different parts of the businesses. We did a day at the end, a demo day where they presented to investors. And in that way, I started to meet local investors in Pakistan. People were literally coming up to me being like, Kalsoom, I have all this money. Where do I put it? I want to invest in entrepreneurs. And I was like, I know entrepreneurs. So all of this was so wild, wild west back at the time, right? Obviously, people like Jahanara, all these people have been doing this for years. And so many of us, when we were starting out, it was literally, now there's a startup event happening almost every day in Pakistan. Back then, it was lucky if it was once a month, right? And even then, it wasn't even startups as much as it was like the outsourcing people, like all this stuff going on. And so Invest Innovate started with just an accelerator program back then. And we would every year change it, grow it. We would listen to what founders wanted. We would grow the batches. We then went from being just in Lahore to saying, like, I remember this was like literally a gas station on the motorway conversation with my colleague at the time, where shout out to Azair, where we literally were like, why not? Why are we stuck to doing it in Lahore? Let's do it in Karachi, Islamabad, whatever, because then people from all over the country can apply, right? That's how the accelerator was born. It became 6 weekends over 4 months. We'd always start it in Bourbon or Murray or something up in the mountains where it was just a retreat, the first one, just about building community. And there was something so radical about that I never realized at the time of founders that, especially in Pakistan, everything can feel so elbows up and people don't trust each other. So to kind of create space where people create a community and trust with one another, a lot of the friendships I've seen born out of our program, I still see those entrepreneurs as friends with one another, right? Which is amazing. And so we started with just building out the accelerator. But then what happened is that as we started to build, then people were like, oh, you're building this accelerator. Can you help us build our accelerator in Bangladesh? And that's how we worked in Bangladesh for the first time. Or this Australian government partnership was saying, can you train 7 incubators and accelerators across Southeast Asia? I was like, yeah, because obviously I remember meeting these guys from Fiji and Singapore. The same issues they were facing in Fiji with how to build angel investor communities, I knew because of Pakistan, right? The problems were the same. So to the point even earlier about Bangladesh and Pakistan, I never see differences. I always automatically focus on the similarities. And so we started to grow outward that way. We started to then do research because literally I remember someone from the World Bank came to me and they're like, can I just download all the information that's in your head of what's happening in Pakistan? This was in 2014. And I said, yeah, sure. And I was a researcher. I came in defense contracting. I was an analyst. So I knew how to write. I knew how to do research. I believe in research. That was the first ecosystem report that came out about Pakistan in 2014. And since then, we've done one in 2017, one in 2019, one in 2021. We've actually benchmarked the ecosystem then. Then we started to put out data on what was happening in Pakistan. So I think now it looks like a very lovely story that Invest to Innovate has done all of these things. MashaAllah, yay, what's awesome. But at the time, it was literally just do what's in front of you. Listen to what, for us, the center of everything has always been founders. Like if entrepreneurs believe you're creating value, you're doing good work. And that's how we changed our program. That's how we made it better every year. And then we kept solving for the problem in front of us. We're like, there's no angel investor community. Let's help build one. Incubators and accelerators elsewhere want to take what we're doing. Let's customize that curriculum. Let's build in that revenue. The research came out because people were like, we need good data about Pakistan. So that's how that was born. And the fund was really similar, right? The becoming an investor happened accidentally. It wasn't because I was like, I need to be an investor. Don't have an MBA. I still think MBAs are cool, by the way. I would love to have an MBA. But I just literally said, I was like, we're doing all this work of helping entrepreneurs in Pakistan, connecting them to investors. And I would see all these amazing founders get these really bad terms from investors, right? Vulture capital in terms of instead of venture capital. They would want 50%, 60% of your business. And I remember thinking, again, the injustice of it all. I was like, that's so wrong, right? And I would be upset about it. I'd have founders I wasn't even working with call me up and say, hey, I just got I know I don't know you, but I just got these terms, right? Can you just tell me if this is a good deal or not? And most of the time it wasn't a good deal, but Pakistan is in so many ways, we've existed in scarcity. So every time we get something, we think this is the best we can do, right? And I remember just being someone who wanted better for everybody. And so the fund really was born out of that. It was born out of saying like, hey, actually, we understand founders really, really well. We understand this market really, really well. I knew I didn't want to do it alone. So that's really, I had been a solo founder at that point for 8 years. It's really hard. And doing it with Misbah, who I'd known for 15 years at that point. And now it's been 15 years. At the time, it was maybe 11 years. I knew she came more direct, even though her path was not linear as well, but had more of that MBA finance background. So she matched me really well. So that's really where the fund was born. But with Invest to Innovate, it was really built on this idea of how do we help build a healthy startup ecosystem in markets like Pakistan. And that's where it came from.
And so the ventures started in 2019, 18?
We opened our doors in 2019, August of 2019.
And so 2011 to 2019, how were you essentially funding I2I? Because, the ventures part, I totally understand. I'm assuming that what you're doing here is you're taking investors and you're identifying startups and you're basically managing that fund.
Yeah.
For those investors, right?
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
It's a pretty given model.
Yeah. But in terms of really building an ecosystem, who funds that? and how do you make money out of it? Because
not a lot of money there.
Startups aren't, you can't have a subscription from startups, pay us $50 a month sort of a situation.
Yeah.
Was this the partnerships with, let's say, the Australian government or other governments?
Yeah, we would get contracts from Australian government, the World Bank, the IFC, Facebook. And that all started to come later, honestly. I was I don't even know what I did.
Credit
card
first few
debt.
years, how did you manage to?
A lot of it was corporate sponsors.
It was corporate
individuals.
sponsors of the accelerator. We'd bring in outside people to come in and fund it. But, I think that honestly, it was not a very lucrative business for the first 7 years of the company. And honestly, it was keeping the lights on. How do we keep the lights on, right? And I remember thinking, I was like, God, I could be earning so much more money doing something else right now. But I just genuinely believed in this. I really believed. I remember even talking to my mom about it because she was like, when are you going to be done with this, right? And in a very loving, motherly, worried kind of way. And I said, honestly, in my gut, I believe this needs to exist.
Because it's one thing to really do all of that. I've been doing content since 2010, right? Yeah. And there have been years when there was no money.
Yeah,
you're doing it because you're having fun with it.
Yeah.
And for a lot of those years, I was alone. And so in worst case scenario, I'm not paying anyone.
Yeah.
I know for a fact that you guys have people on payroll as well.
Yeah, and so now we've gotten really lucky because the irony is that you're doing all this great work, but no one believes it's good yet, right? You have to build. You have to build it. So in the building phase, I'd say it was not a lucrative business. I definitely was funding it on my own somehow and keeping the lights on and getting money here and there for corporate accelerators, getting small projects here and there to keep. Always was that way. Now, mashallah, we've built a healthy business and it's healthy became profitable in terms of these large contracts, in terms of revenue that we've brought in terms of even thinking about our research products, and now people hiring us for consulting. We just actually came from like a big strategy with the Invest Innovate team about this, right? And so we've now, because we've built that reputation, because we always focused on doing good work, that led to us being able to then honestly build in like revenue streams that then lasted and helped build a company where today, like, the company doesn't need, it doesn't need someone to fund us, right? We have contracts that come in and it is from that angle project-based, but we needed to build it to get to that point. And it was hard. There were many, many points that I was really like, I'm crazy. Why am I doing this?
I think you were also great about being flexible in terms of make the most of what you got, right?
Yeah.
So if you were able to get sponsorship for 8 companies, you'd run the program with 8 companies. If you were able to get it for 15, you'd run it with 15, rather than say, no, if I don't get 15 companies worth, I'm not going to do it. So I think, you really demonstrated that hustle in terms of saying, I'm going to take what I can get. I'm going to convince people why this is great. And people came in believing in Kalsoom, but also, that started going from strength to strength because they saw what the output was.
Yeah. And it wasn't just me, right? Like, I think about the team that we've had over the years. Like, you interviewed Mina Tariq now at Metric. We're investors in Metric, but Mina and I worked together at Eye for 4 years, right? Hasan Mukhtar now is like at like Facebook or Meta now. Saad Hamid was with us and worked at Google then after. And like, we just had these incredible people that worked at the company that really kind of filled the gaps and believed in the vision. And I think I was always, I hope, really good at like finding good people. To Misbah's point about like the minute she said sabbatical, I heard, you should be working on this fund with me. But a lot of my best hires over the last 10 years have been people that literally, I was like, they didn't even see it themselves. And I was like, you should come work with us. Like, this is what we're doing, right? And being an evangelist and believing in this vision and knowing it, because I think at Pakistan, sometimes things are always about a personality. And I never wanted to build something about Kalsoom Lakhani. It wasn't about me. I was like, this is about the work. And so I think that attracted people that also believed in the work, right?
Makes sense. Misbah, tell me about I2I Ventures. What are some of the startups that you guys have? You mentioned Metric. Metric, we're all a huge fan of Metric. Shout out to Mina Tariq. This is the third episode I'm giving a shout out, Mina.
We've interviewed a lot of our companies, by the way. You've interviewed Chuck It In, Easy Bike, a few others.
Yeah.
A few others.
So tell me the names of all the ones that are publicly available.
They're all publicly available, actually, except for one that we just closed a deal. So I2I Ventures is an early stage fund. In technical terms, we invest at pre-seed and seed stage. And what that really means is that we come in pretty early in the life cycle of a startup. And like Kalsoom said earlier, because we've been working with founders for so long, that DNA of founders is something that we can identify, that we thrive on, and that we're really founder driven from that perspective. And we like founders that are building in big spaces, that are solving big problems, that are looking at big opportunities. So while our mandate is specific in terms of stage, it's not specific in terms of sector. So we look across different sectors, but we evaluate each opportunity in terms of how, what is the potential for it to grow? How big is this market opportunity? Is it a nice to have or a have to have product? Is it solving a problem? Is it actually addressing a need or a gap in the market? And as it would be in Pakistan, there are a lot of those spaces because a lot is broken. So where there is, where there are gaps, there is opportunity. So we like founders that have a big vision and then that are rolling up their sleeves and, just working on getting that done. We've just approved our 13th investment. We've invested in 12 companies that have been in the spaces of Fintech. So in Fintech, we've invested in Abhi, which is earned wage access, Credit Book, which is working with in the credit chain with MSMEs. We've invested in Metric that you already mentioned. Uran, which is a female-first fintech focused on starting with committees and then building other products for women and beyond.
Uran is based in Islamabad?
In Karachi.
Karachi, right.
Actually, most of our companies are based in Karachi. Sorry, Islamabad.
And also SafePay, which is building payments for e-commerce merchants. And that's all in the fintech space. We like to joke that because of my background in fintech, I'm often the cynic. I'm the grumpy granddad on the fintech calls. But despite that, we found great founders to invest in the the Fintech space. We think there's a big opportunity there. And then outside of that, we've invested in marketplaces. We've invested in Taza, which is an agri-tech. We've also invested in Dealcart, which is looking at bringing groceries in a group buying model.
Not quick commerce.
Not quick commerce.
I hear grocery and I...
Us too, by the way.
Us too. We immediately passed on
the pulse has gone beyond 150 and there is a lot of cynicism there, but okay.
And actually,
But
we're
what's
focused
really
on
great-
the opposite of quick commerce with this one.
I'd love to talk to these guys, by the way. They're also based in Karachi.
They're Lahore
Karachi and Lahore
yeah.
based.
They should
The good news is that we're going to Lahore on the 14th to 18th of November, and Karachi from the 23rd to
Perfect.
3rd of December.
Wonderful.
So we can get
Amazing.
We'll
any
connect
folks
you
from
with
there.
everybody.
Perfect.
But what's great about their approach is that they're looking at middle and lower income segments and trying to see how they can encourage group buying within those segments, gamifying the approach and actually giving them access to cheaper products, because they not only look at tier 1, but they look at tier 2 and tier 3 brands. So what that means is that people have access to cheaper brands.
Right.
And so I think, we'd love for you to speak to them. I think you can make up your own mind.
And you
after.
don't get your groceries in 15 minutes, but that's okay because they care about the prices actually being good for them, right?
Makes
That's
sense.
what matters.
Makes sense.
We've invested in EdCasa, which is an edtech, and is focused on helping students with exam prep.
Yeah, you interviewed Fahad as
You
well.
interviewed Fahad. We've also invested in TeleTalk, which is a communications platform, both B2C, but also B2B.
How's TeleTalk doing? They've been quiet for a while. I remember I saw their pitch maybe a couple of years ago, and that was very exciting.
Yeah.
They've been really focused on the B2B side of things, and that
Interesting.
is actually really interesting and exciting. So that might be why they're quiet on the B2C side.
Interesting.
And have I left out? I haven't been counting who I've gone through.
Metric, Truck It In.
Truck It In. Obviously, you interviewed Sarma. This is the logistics space, so they look at freight. Rider is last mile for e-commerce, so also logistics, but a different segment.
Easy Bike.
And Easy Bike, who he has also been
Also here.
and is based in Islamabad.
Yeah, we were actually just at their new facility today, which
How's
is
that?
awesome.
How is that?
Awesome.
It's really exciting.
It was so fun.
I mean, Easy Bike is one. I'm super excited about Easy Bike.
We are too.
Just want to see what they're gonna do. I feel like what they're gonna be 4 years from now is beyond anything that anyone is imagining right
But
now.
that's also why, honestly, Muzamil, we invest in the founders, right? Because what we're seeing today, and even when we invested in Easy Bike, I met them. They were part of the accelerator, the IDA accelerator, with Roamer, the original concept, right? We didn't invest in Roamer, but then when Easy Bike came about, even then we were like, B2C, like electric vehicles, how many people are going to do it? And then we started to see as petrol prices were going up, as things were going on, we're like, there's actually a lot here. And because we believed in Ali and Hadi, that's what the bet was on.
I think it's all about the founders, because
It's
with
all
Easy
about
Bike,
the
it's all about the founders.
100%. It's all of our companies. It's all about the founders. You met Sarmad, right? I mean, to be in the freight space and trucking, and it's not just Sarmad, that's, Heather and Reza as well, and their entire team. Like, these guys are just like the grittiness that they show, and that type of hustle is honestly, like, as someone who's worked with founders in this market for 10 years, like, you know the difference between people who are really good at talking about what they're going to do and then people who are really good at getting in there and just doing things, right? So that's what
the interesting part. A lot of people have asked me, who are some of the most, I've spoken to a ton of startups, and they're like, who are the short success in your opinion, on and off camera, right? So obviously we have conversations on camera, and then we have conversations off camera. And there are 3 people I've mentioned who I believe are going to be billionaires in Pakistan. Interestingly, all 3 of them are in your...
Surprise.
So it's insane how you've been able to really, wow.
Which ones are they?
Off camera.
But wow. And so I'm gonna move towards more of your opinion on the ecosystem. But tell me a little bit about how's the funding side of things now, post 2021. The world is in a mess. I'm not even going to get into the whole geopolitical situation that's happening, because honestly, it would give anyone nightmares. But even if the current situation sustains, it seems like money for developing or emerging markets is drying up. Nobody wants to invest in risky markets. Pakistan is not just a risky market in terms of the economy, but also there's a lot of political up and down that's happening. And so 2 questions. First, are most of your investors from outside of Pakistan, or are people from within Pakistan investing as well? And second, how do you see how's the funding situation right now, and how do you see it over the next year?
Yeah, we're actually, as a fund, we're set up outside Pakistan. So that often means that people who have funds only in Pakistan are not able to, invest in funds outside. So we do have some Pakistanis, but those are all people that actually have been able to invest from outside the country. So most of our investors are actually from outside Pakistan. I think in terms of, where the market is today, yes, obviously Pakistan is seen what the global economy has seen. I think venture funding is kind of shrunk everywhere across the world. So Pakistan is no exception where that is concerned. But like you said, we're also a little high on that risk spectrum. So it's usually those markets where money sort of steps back from sooner. And so we started seeing this happening at the early part of the year in the first quarter. And then, of course, it started, getting more acute. Global economic trends, but also geopolitical trends in the global market impacted everybody in terms of fuel prices. We, like you said, we have our own issues to add on, even in pure economic terms, just in terms of inflation and the deficit, etc. So I think what has happened is that opportunistic money is definitely not coming to Pakistan for a while. I think people that believe in the opportunity are still bullish. We're definitely, medium to long term bullish on Pakistan. Our fund exists to invest in Pakistan. We will continue to do so. And there are peers in the space also that are funding in startups in Pakistan. And I think that funding will continue to be there. What's going to be different this time around is that there'll be potentially, I don't think there'll be that crazy fever that we were seeing in terms of the space of deals, maybe not even valuations being crazy high, which is not a bad thing. I think we were in any case expecting...
I think it became sort of like a vanity contest.
Exactly. And we were expecting a bit of correction anyway to happen in 2022. That just got accelerated, right? So I think what's going to happen is that good business models and good founders will still find money, both Pakistani and from outside, whether it's a region, which is a little bit more conducive to Pakistan, or global investors. But I think that heyday of like anybody being able to raise money is not there right now, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think what has also happened is that founders recognizing this have started focusing a lot more on fundamentals. You've been speaking to a bunch of them, right? They've gone back to basics in terms of what is it going to take to make this business succeed? What if I'm not going to be able to raise money in 6 months? Phir kya hoga? How do I build a business that is on a path to profitability? And so that mindset shift is also good, I think.
I think it's not just, so it's one thing to really pivot towards profitability. I think another is really building the foundations. And when you're scaling so high, you really sort of dismiss what's really happening on the ground. We saw the case study with Airlift as well. There was a huge report on that. But a large part of their problem was, these thefts that were happening or the losses that were happening in the warehouses, right? And I understand the founder, because obviously he's being pushed to scale, so he can't really focus on those areas. But if you really want Pakistan as a solid market, you really have to make sure that it's a foolproof. The fundamentals, the technology stack, the operations are all foolproof.
Or at least you're building towards it, right?
It has to be a market that can stand on its own, right? So if funding dries up tomorrow, Pakistan startups shouldn't be like, literally like, what do we do, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like this was a really good wake-up call. But I think before you even talk about what is happening in the dry up now, you have to also unpack why 2021 even happened, right? And that it was a convergence of all these factors, which was, outside investors that were much more comfortable with remote diligence, right? They were doing diligence off of Zoom, right? In Pakistan, which is very operationally intensive, you have to go see things, right? We were already investors in Easy Bike, but we were at their facility today, right? Like seeing things, the parts, like all of this stuff. It's important to be able to see things and tangibly touch things, I think, in person. But that was one reason. The other thing was the whole co-legislation happened where all of a sudden startups could set up holding companies abroad. And that happened last year, the state bank legislation, right? And Misbah was actually on the working group for that. That was a game changer, because all of a sudden investors were like, I don't have to put my money inside Pakistan, I can put my money inside Delaware, right? Which is great. The other thing was that all of a sudden all these funds had all this money and they didn't know what to do with it. So they just threw it at all these places. So I think when you unpack the reasons and then you come back into right now, the thing is what we need to realize is that money was never strategic money to begin with, right? That money could dry up up at any time. And the fact that it could literally dry up like that means that it was never going to be there for the long term anyway.
Yeah.
So we always have to act like this, because I always think for us, it's like we definitely rode that wave. We had so much money come into Pakistan last year. But even you said this, it's like the pivot to profitability. That is a very problematic term. Why were we pivoting to profitability to begin with, right? Why was that never not the case to begin with? And I think that also speaks to venture capital and what's valued in this space, which is growth, but never a concern about like, is there a foundation that works here? Like, can this business survive if funding dries up? And I think with Pakistan especially, we had a lot of early stage funding, and we continue to have a lot more early stage funding. But what happens when a company needs to raise their Series B, Series C round, the D round, right? What gets them to that exit? And we still have very few players that exist there. And so now it's become just much more apparent of that case. But I think, to Misbah's point, the businesses that are going to survive now are the ones that are going to be building those good foundations and building actually good businesses to begin with.
Makes sense. Misbah, if I were to ask you, you have that sort of financial services background. And like you mentioned, you're pretty cynical when it comes to fintech plays, but you have invested in a lot of them.
Majority of our portfolio.
I feel like when I look at there's an image on Facebook that has logos of all the fintech players in Pakistan, and it's mind-numbing to see the variety of people trying to solve their problem. But somehow, and it's not even like they're doing a poor job. They're doing the fundamentals pretty okay. They have the app, they have the tech stack, they have the operations, I would say. Somehow Pakistan is not evolving into a conducive digital payments market for some reason. We've been hearing it for a very long time. But the maximum, so Sadabhai CEO was here, and it was a great interview. After his episode went out, I saw Sadabhai, there was a notification which said, we have updated a new feature, and now you can buy mobile top-ups. And it's just, I wanted to take my hair out, because mobile top-ups is the extent of the use cases that we ever end up on. And I really want to go back to your original point of really trying to understand the problems, not just as a business, okay, this is the potential market size and this is what could happen, but really, you use the word financial access early days, maybe when you were working on with Acumen. And Pakistan, even today, 12% people have bank accounts. Majority of the people are locked out, and for some reason they're not coming in. It's I don't know what the problem is, and so how do you see particularly the fintech space? Because I know I would say yes, that is the biggest opportunity in Pakistan right now, not just in the startup space, but really in the economy space. You go towards digital payments, and you'll solve a billion different problems, from taxation to transparency, black to white. Right. But somehow it's not happening. Yeah. What's going on there?
And that might be part of the answer lies in part of that question as well. But I think, look, there are a couple of things. We see a lot of players in fintech, because fintech is a very big space, and you have several verticals in fintech. You can talk about payments, you can talk about insurance, you can talk about mobile top-ups and other services. You can talk, and again, even in payments, there's payment gateways, and there's a lot, and store of value, such as wallets, committees, and buy now, pay later. All of that comes in fintech. So it's a very broad space. And so I think we will continue to see many players in it. I think it is fragmented in Pakistan because people are trying to solve the problem in different ways. I always think of this as a push and a pull issue. I think when it comes to the government has been pushing certain digitization policies, but I think it needs to do more. And I think where it could do more is maybe look at what India did in terms of digitizing and encouraging removal of cash. We're a cash-loving society. We love cash. We like the trust factor of cash, right? So to be able to move away from that, we have to have incentives for people to feel like, acha, if I'm going to use an electronic payment, if I'm going to put money in an electronic account, it's not going to disappear.
Yeah, and especially because, right now, if you pay with a debit card or a credit card, they charge you a rupee. Like they're literally disincentivizing digital payments.
And so the challenge is, one, the trust doesn't exist to begin with. Secondly, right now, there aren't enough incentives in the space, in all of these different spaces, for example, for merchants to actually digitize more. And instead of, the government is trying to work towards it, but instead of encouraging them to digitize, there's this thing hanging over their head, कि, oh, we'll come into the tax net.
Right.
The government will now know how much we're making, and FBR will come after us. And so there is a deterrent to digitization. And so those that do get pushed to digitize actually don't want to pay the charge for it, and they pass it on to the consumer, where they're probably one of the few markets where it's like, Baji, aap cash pe lengi to discount milega, right? Like you're saying, you actually get money, you have to pay extra to use a card. And I think so the government needs to acknowledge that. And if we really want to bring about electronic payments in a big way, there needs to be incentivization of digitization at the merchant end. And there also needs to be some trust that is built at the consumer end. So consumers, and that will come with information, that will come with getting familiarized. And I think that's where the pull factor will come. So the pull factor will come when we started seeing a little bit of this in COVID, when people will start using electronic methods of payment and say, oh, this is actually really great.
Yeah.
I don't have to sit by waiting for my delivery to come to pay cash on delivery. I can actually order food and not have to be home. I can use my card online. So I think the pull factor will come when people start recognizing the convenience of electronic payments, which will happen, but it'll happen over time.
Sense. I think when I look at the fintech space, one particular question that I really have is on credit scoring. I think Pakistan really has lacked that since forever. And I think now with now that we're in the data age, it shouldn't be that difficult. But whenever I think about credit, I think about how there are so many individuals doing a lot of individual analysis, and everybody is trying to build their own sort of credit rating system. And every time I've spoken to a fintech, I've asked them, is there a marketplace for data in Pakistan where you can build on? So let's say, for example, the data. So let's say, for example, there is the RAAST, and then there is Bazaar, and then there are so many of other players in different spaces. How do you identify, let's say Kalsoom buys some stuff on the RAAST and some on Foodpanda and some this and some that, and that all of that data can potentially tell a lot about her in terms of her ability to pay back, right? And because there is a chicken and egg problem where every player is like, if I have enough people and enough data, I should be able to create a product. So either I see two outcomes. There's going to be a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and eventually we're going to have that holy grail of that perfect mechanism to identify where anyone can plug in, and the algorithm would know whether they have the ability to pay or not.
Yeah.
Or there has to be partnerships on a crazy level, which in a country like Pakistan, where there is an incredible amount of trust deficit, it's very difficult. Or there is an opportunity for a middle startup player, I don't know, that essentially becomes your escrow for data, where different startups can plug in and say, okay, here's my data and here's your data, and we can learn from you and you can learn from us, and it helps all of us really build better profiles. Because and I know for a fact that, the government, I've stopped expecting anything from the government, and so I'm trying to figure out how the private sector can accelerate, right? And I think while we can say that convenience is interesting, what I've seen is Pakistani consumer doesn't respond well to convenience.
Absolutely.
I don't think yet, right?
Yeah,
convenience happens later.
Yeah.
To Misbah's point.
For if I were to identify what would really encourage the Pakistani consumer, I think, so I'll give you an example. Just like 2 minutes ago, before we started the podcast, the office boy who works here came up to me and he was like, listen, I want 2 months advance on my salary, because I'm making a house or some sort of a room or something of that sort. And obviously, as an employer, I will base on some sort of a human element. Does he have the ability to pay or not? This and that, X, Y, Z. But he should be able to get access to that credit elsewhere, depending on his ability, right? And that doesn't exist in Pakistan as of right now, and it doesn't seem like it's going to exist anytime soon. I know for a fact that if I tell him, listen, don't stop coming to me again and again, वो भी है ना कि उसका होता है particularly कि वो मेरे पास जब आ रहा है तो वो अपने थोड़ा सा ज़मीर मार कर आ रहा है, वो एक इज्जत का भी एलिमेंट है पाकिस्तान में. He should be able to get that credit. There is nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely.
So if I tell him कि यार listen, like तुम अपनी ऐप यूज़ कर लो, 8-10 महीने यूज़ करोगे ना, तो करने के बाद या डिजिटल पेमेंट्स किया करो, 8-10 महीने बाद तुम्हें इवेंचुअली ये कर्जा खुद से मिल जाएगा. I know for a fact he will switch because he now has a potential product जो कि, and all of them want it.
Right.
Every human being for one reason or the other wants some sort of credit. I feel like we're unable to. I also know that even payments वाले भी somehow credit की बात कर रहे हैं. कहीं ना कहीं उन्होंने अपने credit is a major part of their formula.
Yeah.
But they're unable to do it. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, we have all these companies solving all these issues.
Exactly. So I mean, again, I think there are so many different levels of that problem to solve. You can start with something like Abhi, which is actually providing earned wage access, so these people don't have to come and ask their employer, but it's actually a right to actually access your earned salary at least, right? And then I think, Uran, for example, through their products is building for this market. The demand is huge, and the reason why is because banks have not been incentivized to invest in individuals and SMEs even. Forget about MSMEs. So SMEs bhi kar lein to badi baat hai. And so I think to your point about like what is going to happen in the future and where that gap is, there are some...
And also, what's going to happen in the future where that gap is, and also the interoperability of... So, I mean, Uran will require someone on Uran to continuously build up their sort of profile, and same with Abhi and so on. So how does one sort of be able to switch from one to another and take their credit rating with them?
And I think so there are a couple of credit bureaus that are there in the market now. I think the challenge, and the banks have a lot of data as well from individuals, not enough obviously, but the challenge is also the sanctity of that data, like how clean is it. And I think we often talk about like AI ML, and you can only feed an algorithm, it'll be garbage in, garbage out, right? So you have to get good data in to get good data out, and that's one essential issue. In terms of interoperability, I think we'll get there. I think we've seen, and it's a bit of a Pakistani mindset also, that I'm going to build it myself. But we've also seen, it happened with wallets, for example, where every telco was like, I'm going to build my own wallet, and all that happened was at the end of the day, they got into a price war at the end of the agent, and the customers didn't really benefit because there was no real new inventive products that were coming out. To your point, ke mobile top up add karenge ab, and so I think the challenge is that if you see everything as a competitive space, there's little incentive to come onto an interoperable platform. I think we will get there. Each one right now is building something in their own way. Where they feel like they're actually gathering data which they can verify, that they can validate, and building credit models out of that. People are doing it at, in buy now, pay later. People are doing it, it's some well and some not so well. People are doing it at an individual level, at a business level. Microfinance banks are, looking at that data as well. So I think we're kind of moving to the space where hopefully in a few years we will have more focus on interoperable data exchange, but also right now it's kind of like everybody is looking at how to build it themselves.
Again, so
because they don't
building
access
the foundation, and the scale is going to come maybe in a couple of years when they have some sort of a working model that they can sort of connect with each other.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is that credit data is so important to build models on top of, that people are building that. There is an acknowledgement that we need to build that credit data and go from there. But I think also one thing that microfinance banks have been doing, for example, is that they use proxies. So they don't look at salaried individuals, they may look at farmers, and say if this farmer is cultivating this size of land, his or her ability to pay back a loan of 2 lakh, 1 lakh is this. And I think there's an opportunity there. I think to the point about consolidation, there will definitely be consolidation because there are a lot of players building small
and there
in
is
small
consolidation
spaces
happening, right? So Thesis Financial was acquired by like an outside player coming in. I mean, they had data that was probably like a part of the reason.
And that's what I'm saying. Particularly, आपने बड़ा अच्छा point raised किया with the farming. The reason why I'm saying this, there might be a requirement for a third party that has no products of their own, but is really gathering data to one sort of unique identifier, maybe your NIC. Is I was speaking to this startup, उनको दियोसाई ने I believe fund किया है, Farmdar. And Farmdar again has nothing to do with fintech. But the technology that they have can easily tell you exactly what's going to happen with this particular farm, and the ability for that farm to be able to pay and credit.
I mean, it's the argument that everyone becomes a fintech eventually.
Right? And so my thought is everybody doesn't need to be that fintech. There needs to be one player that can, all their job is to really take the Farmdar data convert that into the fintech language, be able to sell that to the through. Because Famda ka bhi ye tha ki eventually we're going to plug into a fintech player, and I'm just
be able to leverage that. Yeah,
absolutely.
So I think the challenge, there is a privacy question there, Muzamil, and we do need to keep that in mind. I mean, again, there are countries that are more focused on privacy than Pakistan. We're not very high on that list. I think NADRA could be a game changer. There's a lot of talk about how to leverage that data better. The unique identifier is coming into a place with RAAST, for example, right? So we're starting to build some of these blocks towards that. But I think privacy is going to be a question mark when it comes to someone's data being shared. Like, I may not want my data being shared, but I'm okay sharing it where I have an independent relationship with you. So if I have a relationship with Abhi, or if I have a relationship with Uran, I'm okay to let them know, for them to use that data to improve my credit score. So Uran, for example, on their app has a credit score that you can see. And as you become better at payments, to your point about like each one is tracking it at their own level, as a consumer, I'm okay with that because that's a one-to-one relationship. But I might not be okay with Uran sharing that data with 5 other players. Right? Unless it comes to the point where I'm giving permission because I want to access something else from someone else. So I think there will be this interplay of privacy, permission, along with the infrastructure being built to be able to access that.
How do you see RAAST, by the way? Is it as revolutionary as it's being played?
I think it could really be a game changer. I think it's been really slow to get off the ground. There's the multiple phases of it. Even the first phase hasn't really been implemented all that well.
Issue kahan se aa raha hai? Like State Bank ki side se aa raha hai ya people are not responding to, because my understanding is similar to UPI, right? And UPI has been incredibly huge in India. But RAAST somehow wasn't able to gain that traction.
But did UPI take off right away?
Yeah, I think it's really early days.
Everything takes time, right?
I think it's early days. To be honest, I don't know specifically whether the issue is at the end of like the API consumption that fintechs are doing or banks are doing, etc. I mean, I definitely know that there are active transactions, and it started with the individuals and now going into merchant payments as well. But I think those are teething problems, right? So we'll get to that point. I think what's good is that it really brings down the cost of transactions. And that's where you start looking at other players coming and building off of that. So those rails are very important in an ecosystem. India built that with UPI. I think RAAST is important from that perspective. I think we will get there. When it was being implemented maybe 2 quarters ago, I know people were like, this is not going to happen for another 3 quarters. And I was actually more bullish, and I think it will probably get into next year by the time it really takes off. And that's okay if it's done right, I think. But it is a big opportunity. And because of the price aspect that it brings in, I think it could really encourage fintechs and banks and other players in the finance space to build off those rails and then be able to offer different products and services.
Right. You mentioned NADRA, and I know that NADRA because NADRA could potentially be incredibly huge if, considering they're the center point, they're the heart of your unique identifier. And I know every time you have to sort of poke them and ask them whether this person is really who he is, I think it's a 50 rupee charge. Do you think that's a broken model? Because I feel like they're really just trying to milk a very small amount of requests where they could really bring that 50 to, let's say, 1 rupee, allow startups to make however many requests they want, but I think the revenue is going to be much, much higher. Because right now they're really slowing down the innovation for a lot of these startups who require that verification. The 50 rupee charge doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it also integration questions in terms of how easy it is to get into that, and the price, obviously. So yeah, absolutely. I think this definitely needs to be looked at, and I think there's an opportunity to improve how it's working, because it really could be a game changer in terms of accessing that. Right? Imagine a world where I can access different credit services because I have a credit score. Now, you as a credit giver don't need to know all the details of what a transaction I've done with Abhi and what transaction I've done with Uran and whatever, but you know what my credit rating is. Right. That could be powerful in itself, right? And that comes back to that unique identifier.
Makes sense. Moving away from fintech, and I see that you guys have, with Taza, you guys have been in agri. And agri, I feel like, is very exciting. I think it's super random exciting right now, but I think 5 years from now, everybody would be getting into agri.
I mean, there was 4 companies that came up around the same time as Taza, so I feel like everyone saw the same opportunity.
So what are your thoughts on agri in Pakistan?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, Misbah was also like, when at Acumen, you guys were investing in agri way back when. I think it's interesting because if you looked at, these players that were early on, I think a lot of Taza, Easy Fresh, GA Kisan, which is now just GA Technologies. There's a few other players that have come into that space. Everyone looked at it from Mandi to retailer, right? That part of the supply chain. So everyone was trying to address that particular part of it. And I think that's why we saw the most amount of activity, because we saw that you could grow really fast in that, right? If you could like hack that, that would be where growth was. And that would be where the venture play was. If you looked at this a couple of years ago, I think it was Mandi Express, that was a few years ago, right? The traction that they had was really good, but it took them a really long time to get to the same place that Taza was able to achieve in a few months, right? And yes, part of it is that like, and obviously we're biased because we're investors in Taza's, part of it is because Taza's really good founders that kind of brought a really fresh perspective. They kind of came from, they were ex-Careem, ex-Swivel, but also Abrar was at L'Oreal, so FMCG. So they kind of came at it from a different lens, but also it was a convergence of where the agri space was moving, right? Where technology was moving. And so even when you look at when Misbah was at Acumen, when we were investing back then, it was called patient capital because we weren't there yet in terms of adoption, right? And I think in the agri space now, you were talking about Farmdar and Sherry that's one of his investments. There's a lot that can happen in this space. It's just about where the spaces are in terms of if you are a venture capital fund specifically, where you can see that type of hockey stick growth right now. I think agri as a whole is a massive opportunity in Pakistan. It's massively fragmented, massively broken. And I mean, the fact that we're a net importer of so many products, and yet we can like literally change that if we fix the inefficiencies in our supply chains, to me is bogus. I was like, this is crazy. This is something that needs to be fixed. I think that it's huge, and it's also about timing, right? It's like where are the spaces that can be fixed right now? And Taza, has launched a bunch of new products recently, right? In terms of platforms that are focused on like outputs and inputs, that are looking at a global market, especially in the current environment that we're in. And those guys are always, what we love about Abrar and Mohsen and their team is they're always thinking like 5 steps ahead, right? They're always thinking about like, what if Pakistan's produce could go to the world, right? Like what if, and these very audacious ideas that I think that not a lot of other players are thinking about. So I think the agri space as a whole is massive. I think we've only done one deal in this space. We'd love to do more, but I think it's also about because we're venture capital specifically, which is a very different asset class, where is the opportunity for venture within that space, not what's worthy, because everything in agri at this point is worthy. Everything in every sector is worthy. But where do we feel that intervention is going to be important?
Makes sense. And
just to add to that, I think it's also that important question of matching the type of capital with the opportunity, right? And we often tell founders, like, everyone doesn't have to raise venture money, but you should identify what kind of investment is right for you if you are to raise investment. Maybe you're a cash generating company that doesn't need to raise. And so I think agri is one of those spaces for sure where every model is not going to be a venture fundable model. And that's okay. Some models will be, patient capital models. Some models will have to start out being grant based. Maybe a model where you're building credit information around farmers will have to be grant based to begin with, because there may not be money in it up front, but the value that can add later down the road would be huge. So I think it's important for us, and this goes beyond agri to other spaces as well, is that what is the match for the right type of investor given the right type of business opportunity?
And also, why do we always attach success in how we look at Pakistan? We look in every startup ecosystem, we attach success of whether or not they've raised venture funding. And venture funding is not everyone's cup of tea, right? Like a company might be way better off with patient impact investors. They might be way better off with revenue-based financing. And I think we need to be able to support all of those types of businesses in this market in order for us to have a healthier ecosystem, not just one that's defined by success based on venture that raises again and again and again at crazy valuations, right? So I think we name that as people in venture. I mean, we entered venture capital to not be business as usual. And we also say to every founder, even on the sister company side, that don't think that just because you're raising investment, it has to be venture capital. Find the type of investment that works for you.
Makes sense. If we're talking about venture capital investment, we've seen fintech, and you're huge on fintech. There's a little bit of agri. There's a little bit of sort of e-commerce,
logistics.
If I were to ask you, how do you see, or rather, what verticals do you see where there might be an opportunity? Maybe people aren't working there right now, but because you've been looking at this space for well over a decade, not just in Pakistan, region and beyond as well. What are some of the more ignored spaces that you think can really be impactful but haven't been touched yet in Pakistan?
I think there's always spaces within spaces, right? So within every sector, I always think that everyone kind of floods to the same opportunity, right? We have like 5 B2B e-commerce players, but like who's servicing, within the spaces of like financing, and I say this with some of our companies already doing this, right? But inventory financing, SME lending, like within those spaces, I think for us, and we've talked about this a lot on different panels, but I would love to see more SaaS plays come out of Pakistan. So Pakistani companies building for the world. I know Nash is doing that with Integrity, which is really exciting as a play. Obviously, Metric is a SaaS play in our portfolio, but I would love to see more of that, right? I think there's a lot of problems to solve. So even in EdTech, I would say that education financing is really interesting. And I say that with like Iran now launched Study Now, Pay Later, right? Which is really exciting. And so I feel like there's still so much to do, but oftentimes we run to the same problem, or we run to a problem where we've seen it done in Indonesia or in India, or literally everyone says to me, they're like, here's an Indian comparable, right? And I'm like, in India right now is like flooded with so much capital that it doesn't really tell you much of whether or not it's working. But I would love to see people kind of saying like, what are and I don't have an answer actually, but whether it's like, sometimes it is fintech, unfortunately. So I'm kind of like, maybe I should move away from fintech. But fintech does a lot of these. Fintech is such a large vertical, right? It's horizontally within fintech, you have many, many places that you could go, and then many spaces that you could solve within each sector that are there. What about you?
Yeah, I think, if you look at the evolution of most early stage markets, there's a troika that starts out, right? And it's logistics, e-commerce, and payments, or fintech. Right. And those are usually, especially in high consumption markets, those are usually the first 3 sectors that start getting built up. And if you look at Pakistan, we've had a very similar sort of experience there. Yeah. Then nothing wrong with it, but that's often considered low-hanging fruit in terms of what you can get started with. Like Kalsoom said, 100% agree that there's spaces within spaces where you can build. I think there are also some big opportunities where when from the outside you look in, you're like, why am I not seeing really fast growing health tech companies, for example? Because if you look at the opportunity in health around you, it's huge. Yeah. You can say that about education. Again, we are investors in Edkasa. We're very proud of what Anam and Fahad are building, but there are few and far between in terms of the size of the issue that education. If
I were to talk to you about education, because that's something that is really close to my heart, and I've spoken to a few people. Again, Fahad is doing a remarkable job, particularly with their new partnership with TikTok. But overall, EdTech has it's just been a nice, shiny, nice to have sort of a startup space in Pakistan right now. And the problem is very real from the out of school children to the children who are actually going to school but are not really getting educated. Yeah. The size of the population, it's a no-brainer.
Right.
But whether or not it should be solved by venture. Right?
That's the question, right? The question is what are the business models within EdTech that venture can solve? Should people focusing on EdTech, which are the different sectors that they're looking at, the different stages of that issue? Every company that's in education may not even be investable. Right. There might be grant models that are required at certain levels. There might be strengthening of public systems that might be required. I think I agree with you. Like, it's such a big question and big gap in Pakistan, and therefore an opportunity as well. But I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer or one magic wand that you can sort of wave and say, okay, all of the education issues have been solved. And I think people will do that at different ends. Now, you mentioned Fahad and Edkasa and Anam, and what they've done is taken one piece of it that is monetizable, that is something that people are already paying for, which is tuitions, after school classes, and saying, okay, how can we do this better? How can we bring in technology? How do we leverage this so we can get to even more people than what people are being able to do with in-house, in-person academies, etc.? Every aspect of the education problem can't be solved by technology, right? And so I think it's important to break it up into different pieces so that you can see what is the solution for each of those pieces.
Yeah. And so much of it is so structural, right, in terms of the problems itself. And I think with, when you look at what the Citizens Foundation is doing here in Pakistan, right, obviously there's a lot of low-cost private schools. There's a lot of interventions, and not one intervention can solve the entire problem. Right. And so I'm really passionate about education as well. I'm sure you are too. It's just that for us as investors, we're like, is that the problem that venture should solve, not even can solve, right? Venture money kind of ruins some sectors, honestly. It just kind of forces people to say, I need to to grow this fast. But education is not something that can be solved tomorrow. It might even be solved in a generation, right? So who are the players that can put in the right building blocks in place, whether it means it's from the teacher training perspective, whether it means it's from a curriculum perspective, whether it means like from a structural like school perspective. And again, to the point of technology, I mean, when Ed Casa first started, and Fahad talked about this in his interview, they started with distant learning, right? In these like very hard to reach schools, really amazing like B2B program that wasn't going to be the venture side of what they do, right? And that's okay too. Like what they were building there had a tremendous amount of impact. In some ways, arguably more social impact than what the tuition side does, which is solving for kind of more middle class consumers. But yeah, that's also within health tech, right? It's like, how do you solve these like very large problems, and whose type of money solves that problem?
Makes sense. For a lot of Pakistani startups, when they're looking at the problem to solve, obviously they're looking at Pakistan. It's a huge problem to solve. But for a lot of people, obviously they're also looking at Pakistan's economy, and they're thinking what is the scale or what's the multiplier that you could potentially take out of it. And I think a large part of that reason was why Airlift was forced into sort of identifying a model where they can go to South Africa as well, and here and there, and so take what they're creating and make it regional. इसको मैं इस तरह से probably switch करूँगा कि जब हम China, when we look at China, for example, and we look at China building iPhones today, we have to really go to the 90s and imagine that Chinese products were considered as these sort of low-grade, large-scale produced products, and it took them 3 decades from starting with plastic ki baltiyan to X and then Y, and then today where they're creating cutting-edge technology and really building the products of the future. And so I look at Pakistan and I'm wondering, do you think our startups over the next decade can be regional? Because I look at Indonesia, for example, and now they're like a huge market with tons of unicorns. And I look at Indonesia particularly because I feel like we have a very common trajectory there, both in terms of the culture of business, also in terms of how corrupt the economy has been, and they've been able to sort of fix that and create a better model. Even with India, so a lot of these, so every time we're doing beginning to try to do something in Pakistan, there's already someone who's 5 steps ahead globally. Do you think, is your viewpoint different, where you can potentially as an investor say that, okay, maybe deal cart, if it's successful in Pakistan, maybe the real money will be when we take it to Egypt and Nigeria and South Africa.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think we're 100%. We're seeing that with Abhi already, right? Like Abhi is already, they just set up in the UAE. They're launching remittance payments with Payrif. They, are talking about Bangladesh as well as another place. Like because fintech is quite leaner, it's not super operationally intensive, it's much easier to move. And also because with earned wage access, a lot of other markets are relatively like early in those spaces, right? So it's easier to do that. But I definitely believe that, I mean, I always notice the similarities among cities, right? And I think Karachi is so similar to Dhaka. I think Dhaka is so similar to Cairo, so similar to Jakarta. Why not, right? But also it's about when you go, right? And it's about not saying like, I need to go regional because everybody else is going to say, okay, how do you justify this valuation, right? But instead say, what is strategic for us? When have we captured enough of this market that we can actually comfortably go to another place? And not saying growth for the sake of growth, right? Which was happening a lot last year. And actually say, like, at what point is it strategic for, as an example, Truck It In, which is building such a cool, like their approach is so interesting, right? And you talked to Sarma for 2 hours, which was awesome. But with Truck Lagbe in Bangladesh, right? There's so many similarities of companies that you might see that are a few years behind. Could you acquire that company? Could you merge with them? Could you partner with this one that's doing it? And so less about like, I need to, because everything is about right? It's like, I need to grow and launch, and instead say, I can partner, I can acquire this player. And that's happening outside into Pakistan a lot right now.
I think with Find My Adventure, I think.
They got acquired. I think to that point, I think think the answer is yes and no, both. Because yes, to what Kalsoom is saying, this regional opportunity, there's absolutely no reason why Pakistani startups cannot take advantage of it. But at the same time, to your point, Kals, about like the timing being the right, it's like Pakistan itself is such a big opportunity. When you find the product market fit over here and you're able to scale, that might be the right time for you to start looking at other markets, because people are looking outside in, wanting to come to Pakistan because they see the opportunity over here, right? And so again, the acquisition of Find My Adventure, but also Tez by Zootpay.
Regional
Saris invested in Jugnu in the B2B e-commerce side. So I think people are looking from the outside, looking at Pakistan and saying, wow, this is a great opportunity. I also think that it shouldn't be too premature for when Pakistani companies start looking regionally. But absolutely, I feel like why not have them grow beyond Pakistan and actually have world-class products. And I think, you have an example of Cloudways, which had a huge exit recently, completely homegrown, great product.
And
bootstrapped completely, didn't raise any venture money, built in Pakistan for a global product. And look at the success that they had with that. So absolutely, we have the talent and the opportunity for companies to start building regionally and go outside.
Yeah.
But we also have a lot over here that we can address.
Yeah, we're a massive market, and I don't think any company yet has fully captured Pakistan.
We're at the 1 hour, 30-minute mark, and I'm responding to the constant protests from all of you guys. I'm going to start wrapping up soon. But I think one of the questions that I have in terms of the entire startup ecosystem and the entire language that's being used around it, not from within the space, but rather from the people who are looking at the space. For them, this is that one sort of, I don't know, क्या होता है वो जो Apple होता है जो सारे मसले solve करता है, but that one thing that's going to solve all of Pakistan's problems, that's one thing that's going to make us rich, and this is the oil of Pakistan. And the problem is that while these are very legitimate problems, most of what I see happening is startups essentially getting rid of inefficiencies, right? So it's really what it's doing is कि leakages जहाँ पे हैं, चाहे वो farming के अंदर leakages हो रहे हैं, waste हो रहा है, उसको कम किया, optimize किया, पैसे बचा लिए. Financial payments के अंदर, make it quick, make it efficient, make it transparent. लीकेजेस को रोको, पैसे बना रही. सो वैल्यू आपको बड़े क्लियर नजर आ रही है. बट व्हेन इट कम्स टू रियली पाकिस्तान की, जब व्हेन यू टॉक अबाउट द पाकिस्तान's economy or political economy, unfortunately, historically, what we've seen is that we have a wealth generation problem. We don't have an optimized. For a lot of people, what they're looking at is, where are we spending our money? The fact is we don't have enough money. So yesterday I was looking at a very interesting stat. A lot of times in Pakistan we talk about the defense budget, right? And Pakistan's entire defense budget is $7 billion. The state of New York spends $10.5 billion on the New York police. So, I mean, just look at the discrepancy. The fact is you don't have, it's not that whatever money you have is just being spent in an inefficient way. You really have to increase the overall pool as well. For a lot of the companies who are doing work, and they have to do that work, it's an incredible work that they're doing. But really nobody's looking at how to generate that additional wealth. And a lot of that is going to come from exports. And a lot of that is going to come from, giving jobs to a huge youth population. And so this is beyond just startups and venture capital money. This is, I want your opinion on really how do we, and particularly yours, because you have that sort of background of, politics and all of that. How do you take Pakistan's economy to a point where we've talked about handouts? Our entire economy has worked on handouts, right? How do we make that economy sustainable so that there's more money for the consumption products that we're creating over here? Because essentially year on year, we're running out of money.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're always in the same default place.
Yeah. And the fact is that if we don't fix that, all of this is wasted.
Yeah.
If we fix that, this is the logical outcome of that, irrespective, right? So one of the, for example, you guys mentioned SaaS, and I think that's an incredibly huge opportunity for Pakistanis to actually generate that wealth. But beyond that, what can we possibly do? Because I'm trying to get smart minds to give me an answer to that problem.
I mean, honestly, the I wish I could say that there's going to be one solution to it, but I would actually say that the biggest problem is that we've, unfortunately, from a political standpoint, we've never had leadership that has been strategic in this country, that have said, how do we rebuild the foundations from an economic standpoint? I mean, these are much smarter minds than me on the macroeconomic front, right? But when we think about the foundations of this country, it's like every time, why are we always getting into a default? Because we've never had people think beyond like a year, 2 years. Like we need to rethink like the next 10 years, right? And I think because we're always in a place of like, we're only going to be in power for this many years. I don't want this person to get credit for this thing that I do now that's going to happen in 5 years, right? So we're always doing these short-term things that don't actually take place. And I wish I could say that like an acquisition in Pakistan is going to be the thing that takes us forward as a country. But until we fix these broken policies and these broken institutions with people who are really smart that we don't just get rid of because they don't fit our political agenda, that's, without getting politicized about it, because for me, that's an equal opportunity dig at whoever has been in power in this country since the beginning. I don't think we can actually address things, to be honest. So that's not an answer to it. It's more just a frustration that I've seen or I've had over the years of like, why can't we be better than this in terms of why have we never had real leadership that has put not a personality, they've put like the country above personality, right? And when it comes to that, then we actually say like, how do we address these problems, right? And we've had like, we've had really great economic minds that almost ran things here and then no longer did, but you listen to how they talk about things and you're like, why can't we just do what he said? Yeah. Why can't we just implement those things, right? And I just think there's always these warring feelings of like people that are rent seeking, that want this, that we're so extractive in how we behave as a society that I never think then we actually can't come from a place of abundance. We never say like, how can I bring the pool for everybody rather than just for myself or for my party or for this person or whatever. And so that to me is, just something that I view as a frustration. It's not an answer to your question.
Misbah, what do you think? I mean, I'll add to this. I think while we, politics or political leaders generally tend to respond to public sentiment, right? So when they're saying, okay, I want to get elected again, these are just my thoughts, but a lot of people are these days saying, this leader, isko to sirf power chahiye. Obviously उसको power चाहिए यार, that's his entire job description. So वो तो एक logical वो है ही. But I think in a democracy, any leader who's trying to take stupid decisions because that will get him votes in the next election का outcome ये नहीं है कि मैं कहूँ कि वो leader stupid है और उसको बेहतर decision लेने चाहिए थे. उसका outcome ये है कि यार public क्यों इस decision के ऊपर उसको vote दे रही है. And so what I'm trying to really figure out is how do you identify, because I've spoken to a lot of people on the podcast, apart from Gonzalo from the World Bank, the only non-Pakistani here, जिसने economy के बारे में बात की थी. He was actually one who gave me very legitimate structural pointers on what needs to be changed. But more often than not, you talk to a lot of Pakistanis and a lot of great minds, and they'll start and end the conversation with, we need structural change. Yeah. And you ask them, what is that structural change? And they'll be like, that's for the politician to know. And that's what I'm trying to figure out, because again, like I mentioned, a lot of our, because what happens is then the politician takes that decision and then that decision can easily be manipulated because the public doesn't know enough. Yeah. We saw that with the what was that, real estate amnesty scheme. Yeah. That's the dumbest, bubble creation in front of everyone. Everybody was participating in that bubble creation.
Obviously people want that short-term gain, right? So,
so trying to really understand in terms of how do you, it's a very stupid move na कि यार imports बंद कर दो, बिल्ली बेचारी खाना नहीं खा सकेगी यार. That's not really solving anything in the long term.
I think for me, there's like accountability is at the root of it all, right? So accountability at a grassroots level where I know who I'm going to hold accountable if I don't get bijli, pani or gas in my house tomorrow when the winter comes, right? As opposed to some politician who's kind of in Islamabad and is not, directly engaged with me. And I mean, there's contentious politics in a lot of countries, right? But I think what Kalsoom was saying as well, we need a sort of a national I think coming together of like accepting a few things that everybody
that
will commit to.
Nobody's gonna play politics
and
on.
then you don't play politics on. You say, we are going to commit to building these few things in Pakistan. To your question about structure, that's one way to do it. And then institutional building. Once you build institutions, they outlast people. And what we need is institutions to be built on meritocracy, on, starting off with things on paper, in theory, hiring the right people for it. It all comes back to education and poverty. So it's a vicious cycle, like you said. उसको पता नहीं है जो आदमी वोट दे रहा है, औरत वोट दे रही है, उसको पता नहीं है कि उसके राइट्स क्या हैं, what can they come out on the streets for,
what can they
और उसके लिए बेहतर क्या है, right? What can they demand, and at the same time where can they hold people accountable? So I feel like this gap of like, and this vicious cycle of like, okay, you give them a biryani and they'll come to your rally, or that you promise them a house loan and they will vote for you. What happens when they don't get that house loan? What happens when they don't get beyond that one biryani at the rally? What happens then? That जो गरीब आदमी जो है उसको तो कल काम पे जाना है, उसको पैसे अर्न करने हैं. He's not going to go out and do भूख हड़ताल or go on strike because he has to feed his kids or she has to feed her family. So it's this cycle of poverty and education that makes things harder, and of course corruption adds a whole other aspect to it. But I think accountability and committing to a national agenda of saying, here are a few things that everybody says we're not going to touch. Uske upar you build things as per, you want more of a social state, you want less of a social state, you believe more in sort of free hand of state or more, involvement, fine. But there's some acceptance and acknowledgement of the basic aspects of building the structure. But otherwise you come to this point of like, that reminds me of that English show, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, where the bureaucracy is the only one that's constant and is running things, but they're also, what is their incentive?
And also what's the leadership there, right, of who's directing them? But I think to the point of giving like a good example, right, of last year, there was really groundbreaking legislative change that happened for the startup space in Pakistan, right? I was mentioning the holding company legislation, but then also like generally the regulations for the fintech space came down. If you asked us, Grumpy Granddad and myself, if we were...
I should change that to Grumpy Grandma.
Yeah, Grumpy Dadi. If we were bullish on fintech 3 years ago, we would have said no, right? Because the regulations were such that it didn't, it didn't allow for that. Or if you said with the SCCP building a sandbox, right, allowing for people to actually build and try and test innovative products, right? All of those things happen not only at the policy level, but those were game changers for this space, right? In terms of we genuinely saw like actual tangible returns. And then the government saw that in doing so, and actually it was because of leadership at the State Bank, leadership at the SCCP, that really allowed for voices in the room. Like Misbah was on one of the working groups. All of us were advocating for that change. Oftentimes we're on these working groups that were like,
nothing happens.
What are we doing? Yeah. And this was the first time that I genuinely felt like, I was like, wow. Like I've been the biggest critic of the policy environment for the startup space in Pakistan. For me, this actually validated and vindicated, because I'm like, if you can change the policies, this can unlock so much.
This was a working group for the State Bank?
Yeah. So several working groups. I've been part of things where at the State Bank, we're looking at whole co-legislation at the SCCP level about defining startups, sandbox engagement with people in the stakeholders. So I think that was, like Kalsoom said, there was a real desire to engage with people and actually listen, and that comes from the top down, right? And
but then
implement
also
policies.
The bureaucracy too, right? Because the bureaucracy actually was like then working like because the leadership was there to actually direct that. And I think you had a really great case study of what can happen, and by reducing those regulations, it unlocked the entire fintech sector, right? By unlocking the fintech sector, yes, all these people are doing stuff in these different spaces, and yes, there's noise, but we're seeing real change happen because of these fintech players that are coming up in this market, right? And when we talk about wealth creation, it starts from the top, right? It starts from policy.
And I think one last point on that, without getting too political, it's also, these are also spaces where people, there are maybe in fintech, there are banks that are incumbents. Maybe in agri, there are artis that are incumbents. Maybe, in e-commerce, there are these old school distributors. But when you come to the point where you don't have a lot of vested interests, you can make refreshing changes. I think the challenge with taking this example and this experience of the regulators really engaging and building with a positive mindset, it's very hard when it comes to more traditional industries. If you talk about sugar or textile or steel or gas, oil and gas, right? Or automotive. Suddenly there you have a very different power dynamic. And I think that's also why this kind of attitude has not been seen to permeate in those kind of industries to bring about that kind of structural change, because there are a lot of people pushing back at that, right?
Makes sense.
We keep extending taxes on salaried and not necessarily other sectors.
Yeah.
And yet we're not improving efficiency in those areas where we can then become globally competitive and help create wealth across the board.
I think that's where, for a lot of times and a lot of historically, what we've tried to do is we've tried to look at where the government is going to lead the change. And now, because of champions like you guys, I've been pretty bullish in terms of the private sector driving that change. And so if I were to sort of handpick something from, let's say, Taza, from within your own portfolio, I think a very potential opportunity in terms of wealth creation would be agri, where sugar will eventually bend down to them if they play it right. So I believe I was speaking to Easy Fresh. I think that episode hasn't come out yet. But they gave me some very interesting insight on how essentially what they're gonna be is the dole. If you guys know of, the ones that distributes bananas all over the world.
Yeah.
And if you can optimize the supply chain in Pakistan and begin to look at markets in Dubai, and I was in Dubai and Saudi a couple of days ago, that's such a huge opportunity. अगर हम एग्री की बात करें, अगर हम मीट की बात करें, इनफैक्ट देयर वाज अ मीट कंपनी जिसका IPO हुआ था कुछ अर्सा पहले, एंड इट्स रिसेंटली बीन एक्वायर्ड बाय अ सऊदी कंपनी, क्योंकि देयर इज जस्ट सो मच opportunity there.
And that's what Taza moved into a while ago, by the way.
And so what I'm thinking is it's not that venture capital is going to exclusively just stick to consumption. I think with the जो economy की सूरत हाल हो रही है, they're gonna start thinking regionally. When they have that ecosystem developed, I think a lot of, and while I do understand के farm के ऊपर venture capital नहीं लगेगा, right? But it's what the venture capital is going to do is create that ecosystem that's going to attract a lot of other money. Like for me, for example, मैं बजाय इसके प्लॉट की फाइल खरीदूँ कि वो डबल हो जाए, तो कल को जब मुझे पता है कि एक फार्म है जिसके ऊपर हम XYZ पौधा लगाकर उसको एक्सपोर्ट कर सकते हैं with all of the insights provided by Taza and the distribution provided by Taza, I can put my money into that farm and make more money. And so the investment then starts driving towards that. And that's where the money start, again, SaaS products हो गई, farm, agri उस तरह से हो गया, और इस तरह के I'm trying to identify areas.
But we're already seeing that happen because there are people who are looking for investment opportunities that may not be venture capitalists. They may be people that have run businesses and made money. They may be people that have inherited wealth, but they are looking at opportunities. Of course, startups became, the in thing, and a lot of people were like, how do I invest in startups? But I think there is an interest because a lot of people are cash rich right now. There is an interest to invest in business models that are going to do well. And I think it's up to all of us to support that in the ecosystem and help these companies access funding, even if it's not venture funding.
I think another great example of what you were talking about in agri is in the electric vehicle space, or in the EV space as a whole, right? When we think about what Easy Bike is doing, it's not just putting bikes out there, right? It's actually saying we have to build the swapping stations. We have to do this. It's you're building an ecosystem. And I think about this, like I always think about this even with our journey with Invest to Innovate, but even with all of these startups, oftentimes you're building the road in front of you, right? And in building the road in front of you, all these other opportunities come up, right? And so in swapping, there's an opportunity there with people that are maybe servicing that space, of people that want to maybe think about a SaaS play within players that are doing electric vehicle or charging, right? There's so much around that makes it really exciting as a play. And so if you only looked at Easy Bike and said, here are these electric vehicle mopeds, it wouldn't be as exciting, right? But for us, the reason we were super excited, we're like, wow, there's an entire sector here that has not developed yet. And if you look and say like the futuristic vision of this, and the guys that are going to build it are like the guys like, Hadi and Ali are always thinking about the next steps and who's going to do this and what this partnership is going to do. The exciting thing is what it's going to look like in 5 years from now.
Makes
right?
sense. I'm going to ask you the last question in this space, and then we're going to move towards the end. You guys didn't get into tourism. Why is that?
We've looked at stuff in the tourism space. We love the tourism space, I think, as tourists and travelers.
As consumers.
As consumers. I think we did look at a few plays in this space. I think the challenge right now with tourism, and I've had plays that have come through the accelerator program, right? So I've seen a bunch of plays that have done that. We looked at Find My Adventure. We love those guys. I think for us, we didn't pull the trigger because I think right now in the way that the economy is moving is travel a nice to have right now. And we invest very exclusively, the way that we think about us at iDive Ventures is we invest in have to have problems, right? And while travel and tourism is a have to have, it's a massive opportunity. Does it become less of a have to have and more of a much more nice to have as consumer spending is shrinking? But that being said, from a consumer perspective, we've both have traveled so much outside and inside Pakistan. Like for me, I feel like my love letter to Pakistan deepens every time I travel here, right? So I think the tourism sector is massive. We just haven't pulled the trigger yet. We haven't found something yet.
Makes sense. Guys, I'm going to ask you the last question that I generally ask all of my guests, and I'm going to break it down into two areas. I want you to give me an answer based on your industry, or rather your space, and that is the startup space, and how do you see that space evolving? And I want then a generalized view of how you see the entire space evolving. You've been to a bunch of different countries. You have a Bengali, Pakistani, very unique experience there as well. And then, you've been with the nature of your work, you're really juggling around a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different people as well. How do you see Pakistan 28 years from now in 2050, knowing what you know now, seeing what you've seen throughout your life? We'll start with you, Kalsoom, and then we'll come to you, Misbah.
From the startup space perspective, this is where I would like to see Pakistan, aspirationally. I would love to see a space that is, when I talk about a healthy and growing startup ecosystem that is thriving, so not just surviving, right? So when I say that, I mean one that is more inclusive. I think right now when we look at, and as the only female-led fund in the country, we've invested in women-led companies, but I've worked with a lot of women in this space. It is just drastic in terms of how much we're getting in terms of women versus men. And I would love to see that shift. I would love to see the status quo start to move towards being more inclusive, generally not just towards women, but also people that may not have an outside degree, right? And be able to raise funding and may speak Urdu better than they speak English. Like that should not be something that holds you up back in building a company. So from a bigger perspective, I would love to see a healthy, thriving startup ecosystem that is on the global radar in a real way. That isn't something that surprises people that, oh, I didn't know Pakistan could do that, right? The amount of times that people are like, wow, like your pictures make me think like, I didn't know Pakistan could be that way. I was like, I want people to not be surprised anymore.
Mainstream ho chuka thoda.
Ha, exactly. I want it to be part of the mainstream, that this is what's cool. And I want to see real success stories that come out of here, right? Not just in terms of what those exits mean. So what Kareem did for the region, I would love to see that happen in terms of what an exit from startups here bring towards creating more companies in their wake. That would be my big. And
beyond startups, how do you see the overall, the economy, the politics, the society evolving?
Oh gosh. I don't know what I see evolving, because I think if I was to predict based off of what we're seeing right now, it's quite sad. It's hard to stay optimistic, but I think I wouldn't be doing this work if I wasn't an internal optimist. So I would love to see like real leadership. I think what I love seeing is that in some of the elections, some of these smaller, like, Awami workers parties, like all these like things that are more progressive and different types of voices come up. I would love to see that diversity at the political level that we don't see now. To me, that would be cool. And it starts out with like voting in these elections, right? Of like voting for a party that may not win, but knowing that like puts a little bit more power behind them, or showing up. And I have friends that are part of these worker parties and part of these different parties that are coming up. And I would love to see that diversity of voices. I would love to see like real leaders that actually put the structural change in place. It's hard to be optimistic when you see kind of all these like people that are just fighting about things that aren't important. And I would love to have us not be in default all the time. So those are my wishes. It's not what I necessarily see happening, but I would love for that to be the case.
Makes sense. Misbah, what about you?
She already said everything I was going to say. It's not fair.
I know, I was thinking you would go first and then I could follow.
So I think, very similar thoughts on the startup ecosystem. I think I would love to have seen, good founders build businesses, create value, like to your point about creating wealth as well, and show that it can be done in Pakistan, that it's a bankable country, that the talent can be bet on, that there is opportunity over here. We have to see some real life examples of that. And if it's startup exits, great. If it's unicorns, great. If it's a thriving, stock sort of IPOs coming and getting listed in public markets, great. All of those things will add to this, like Kalsoom said, not having to convince people that they should be taking a bet on Pakistan. So evidence-based success would be great. And I think, we have all of the building blocks to get there. And I think, inshallah, we're already on our way over there. I think at a broader level in terms of the country, for me, I mean, it's a bit of a negative view, but so far things have been getting worse every year. Just because I feel like we take 2 steps forward and take 1 step back, and I want us to have moved past that. I want us to have moved past that deep low point and then start building towards it. Now, whether that means a reconciliation of sorts, whether that means a revolution, whether that means that we come to terms with what we are, sort of driving away in terms of value, and as the world around us is like, look at climate, for example, right? Yeah. When a wake-up call, before we actually have a wake-up call, that's too drastic. And not just from a climate perspective, but also in terms of the economy and politics and poverty and education and healthcare and all of those things where I feel like I by that time, I want us to be on that trajectory of improvement and not have to sort of slide back into something like which we always do every few years.
Makes sense. Guys, thank you so much for coming in and sharing all that insight.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We're again at 2 hours, so I have sincere apologies on that. But there were 2 people this time around, and so I had to unpack both of those incredible minds. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing all the insight.
Thanks for having us.
It was great to be here.
For all of you guys, thank you so much for watching. अगर आपको एपिसोड पसंद आई, अपने दोस्तों के साथ जरूर शेयर करिएगा. YouTube वाले लाइक का बटन दबाएंगे, एंगेजमेंट बढ़ेगी, ज़्यादा लोगों को तुम्हारी कन्वर्सेशन पहुंचेगी. Facebook वाले नीचे दिए हुए लिंक पर क्लिक करके TBT कम्युनिटी ज्वाइन कर सकते हैं, जहाँ पर डिफरेंट फीडबैक भी लेते हैं, गेस्ट रिकमेंडेशंस भी लेते हैं, आर्टिकल्स भी शेयर करते हैं. You can join that as well. यहाँ पर कहीं पर इजी पैसा जैस कैश सादा पे आ रहा होगा. If you'd like to support the channel, we accept anything from 1 rupee to as much as you'd like. It's a thought that counts. इसी के साथ साथ we are doing something very exciting for season 4, which is starting in a couple of months. And for that, we're starting sort of these branded segments. So if you are from a brand agency or any of those, you can reach out to us. The email address is somewhere around the channel, so you can check that out. But anyways, this was Muzamil, Hasan, Saidi. You were watching Thought Behind Things. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.